The first time anyone in Redstone Creek saw Eleanor Vance after she disappeared, it was nearly 6 years later, and she was selling apples. Not ordinary apples, deep crimson fruit, polished bright and packed in neat rows inside wooden crates lined with dry moss. Each apple was larger than a man's fist, firm, fragrant, and impossibly fresh for the middle of October. She walked into Kessler's Mercantile just before noon. No wagon, no farmhands, just one mule and a quiet black dog pacing beside it. The mule carried 2 wooden crates slung over the saddle. Eleanor untied the ropes, lifted the first crate, and set it gently on the store counter. Kessler pulled one apple free. He turned it slowly in his hand. "Where'd you grow these?" he asked. Eleanor didn't answer. He sliced it open with his pocket knife. Juice ran immediately along the blade. The smell filled the store. 2 ranchers standing near the feed bins stopped talking. Someone took a bite. The flesh cracked clean between his teeth, sweet, sharp, better than anything grown in that valley in years. But the apples were never the real story. The apples were only the thread. And once people started pulling that thread, they discovered something that unsettled nearly everyone in Redstone Creek. Because Eleanor Vance had vanished from the valley after the sheriff seized her land. And yet here she stood, alive, healthy, selling fruit that no one could explain. To understand how that happened, you have to understand how she lost everything in the first place. In the spring of 1883, Eleanor Vance was 29 years old and newly widowed. Her husband, Samuel, had died the previous winter. He slipped while cutting timber along the northern ridge and struck his head on frozen rock. The fall killed him before Eleanor even reached him. They had been married 5 years. They had no children. What they did have was land. 160 acres at the edge of Redstone Creek, a modest cabin Samuel built with pine logs, a small orchard just beginning to mature, 3 milk cows, 2 mules, and a deed registered at the county courthouse. What Eleanor did not know until the week after Samuel's burial was that the land carried debt. Samuel had borrowed $240 from the Redstone Territorial Bank the previous summer. The money paid for orchard seedlings, fencing, and irrigation tools. The note was due in full 18 months later. Samuel planned to repay it once the orchard began producing. But Samuel was dead, and the orchard was still too young to bear fruit. Eleanor discovered the note inside a wooden box beneath the cabin floor. $240. She had $14 in coin, a silver locket, and a few cattle. She rode to town the next morning. The bank manager was a thin, grey-bearded man named Wallace Mercer. He listened carefully while she explained. Then he folded his hands. "The debt must still be repaid," he said. She asked for time. Mercer shook his head. "The bank cannot extend the note." She asked if smaller payments would be acceptable. He explained the agreement did not permit installments. She asked what would happen if she could not pay. "The property would revert to the bank," he said quietly. Eleanor stared at him for a long moment. "And the orchard?" she asked. Mercer shrugged. "Sold with the land." 3 months passed. She worked constantly, sold what she could, but the numbers did not change. $240 might as well have been 2,000. By the following autumn, the sheriff arrived. His name was Conrad Bell. He carried a folded document in his coat. Bell was polite, almost apologetic. But the paper said the same thing every foreclosure notice said. The debt had matured. The bank now owned the property. Eleanor had 7 days to leave. She packed what she could: a bedroll, 2 iron pots, a hatchet, 3 sacks of grain, her husband's rifle, and a leather notebook her mother once kept. The rest stayed behind: the cattle, the orchard, the cabin Samuel built with his own hands. All of it passed quietly into the possession of the bank. 3 weeks later, the land was auctioned. There was only one bidder, a cattleman named Lucas Harrow. He purchased the entire property for less than half the original loan. Eleanor never saw the auction. By then, she was already gone. She left before sunrise on the final morning allowed by the sheriff. The air was cold enough to frost the grass. She loaded the mule with everything she owned and began walking west. No wagon, no destination, only distance. The dog appeared the second day, a lean black animal with narrow shoulders and bright eyes. It followed her quietly through the hills, never barking, never begging, just walking a few yards behind the mule. That night it curled beside her fire. Eleanor named him Cole. They traveled west for nearly 2 weeks, past the last ranches, past the last fence lines, into the hills where the land folded into deep forests and narrow valleys. Eleanor wasn't searching for a town, or neighbors, or help. She was searching for a place no one cared about, because places people ignore are the hardest to steal. Her mother once told her something important about land. Not all good land looks valuable. Some of the best soil hides where no one thinks to look. And the deeper Eleanor traveled into the mountains, the more she began remembering those lessons. Her mother kept gardens, not large ones, but clever ones. She understood slopes, shade, water. She knew how to read soil by color and smell. She knew that south-facing ground warmed earlier in spring, that rocks held heat long after sunset, and that valleys protected plants from wind. Those lessons stayed with Eleanor long after childhood. Now they guided her steps. On the 15th day, she followed a narrow stream into the mountains. The stream disappeared between 2 ridges. Cole trotted ahead through the brush. Eleanor pushed through the trees behind him, and suddenly the forest opened. The valley was small, hidden, maybe 200 yards wide. Granite walls rose on both sides. A creek ran through the center. But the real surprise sat along the southern edge, a long strip of open ground sloping gently toward the water, protected from wind by the cliffs, bathed in sunlight nearly all day, and warmed by a line of dark stone running along the hillside. Eleanor knelt and touched the soil, dark, loose, rich with decayed leaves. She looked around slowly. The valley could not be seen from the ridge above. No trail crossed it. No smoke stains marked the rocks. No axe cuts scarred the trees. No one lived here. She stood quietly for a moment, then she smiled, because in that instant she understood something the bank never would. Land that nobody sees is land nobody steals. She unpacked the mule beside the creek, built a small fire, and opened her mother's notebook. The first entry she read that night was simple. "If you want to grow an empire," her mother once wrote, "start where no one bothers looking." Eleanor closed the book. The valley around her was silent. Cole slept beside the fire. The mule grazed near the water. Above them, the granite cliffs held the warmth of the day long after the sun disappeared. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And unlike the land the sheriff had taken, no one here even knew she existed. If you want to see how Eleanor Vance turned that forgotten valley into something powerful enough to shock the entire town of Redstone Creek, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because part 2 is where the hidden empire begins. The first winter in the hidden valley nearly killed Eleanor Vance. Not because the land was barren, not because the soil was poor, but because the mountains tested everything, slowly, patiently, until only the strongest habits survived. The first frost arrived in late October. By mid-November, snow settled along the northern ridges. By December, the valley floor remained the only place where the ground still showed patches of dark earth between drifts. That was the first lesson Eleanor learned about the valley. The granite walls mattered. They rose nearly 300 feet on both sides, trapping sunlight for hours after the surrounding mountains had already fallen into shadow. During the day, the stone absorbed heat. At night, it released that warmth slowly into the valley floor. The difference was small, but small differences decide survival. Eleanor began studying the land the same way her mother had once studied garden soil, carefully, patiently. She walked the entire valley every morning, watching where frost lingered longest, watching where snow melted first, watching where wind drifted through and where it died. By the third week, she understood something important. The southern wall of granite acted like a massive heat battery. Sun struck the rock directly from late morning until sunset. The stone held that warmth long into the night. And the strip of ground running along the base of the cliff stayed several degrees warmer than the rest of the valley. That narrow strip became the center of everything. Eleanor cleared brush there first, dead branches, fallen pine needles, loose rock. She worked with a hatchet and a small shovel she carved from a flat cedar plank. Cole followed her everywhere, watching quietly, sleeping beside the fire each night. The mule grazed along the creek where snow stayed thin. Food remained the most immediate problem. Eleanor rationed the grain carefully, hunted small game with Samuel's rifle, set crude traps along rabbit paths near the trees. But winter always demanded more planning than hunting. Food had to last. So she began thinking about the future, not just surviving winter, but growing enough food to remain hidden forever. A mother's notebook helped. The pages were filled with short observations, notes about soil, notes about sunlight, notes about planting close to stone walls. One entry stood out immediately. Warm rock grows food earlier than open ground. Eleanor tested that idea the first time snow began melting near the cliff. She pushed a wooden stake into the soil beside the granite wall. The ground remained soft. 10 feet away, the soil was frozen solid. That difference changed everything. She began building stone ridges along the base of the cliff, small walls no higher than her knee. The stones absorbed sunlight during the day, then released that heat into the soil beneath them overnight. Between those ridges, she planted the seeds she carried from the old homestead. Turnips, potatoes, beans, nothing delicate, only plants that tolerated cold soil. She worked slowly through early spring, digging narrow beds, turning soil by hand, building stone windbreaks around each planting strip. When the first shoots appeared in April, she nearly cried, because green leaves meant the valley could feed her. But Eleanor did not stop there. Food alone would keep her alive, but food alone would not build an empire. What she needed was something else. Something valuable enough to trade, something rare enough that the town would never ask too many questions. That answer arrived in early summer. The valley bloomed. Wildflowers covered the hillsides. Blue lupin, yellow balsam root, white yarrow. And with those flowers came bees, hundreds of them, then thousands. They filled the air along the valley floor, working the blossoms from sunrise until evening. Eleanor watched them for several days before realizing what they meant. Her father once kept 2 small hives behind the family house. She remembered how carefully he treated the bees. He said something important once. Bees will make you rich if you give them 2 things: shelter and flowers. The valley already had flowers, thousands of them. What it lacked were proper hives. So Eleanor built them. Not from boards, not from boxes, but from hollow logs she found along the forest edge. She cut the logs into 4-foot sections, split openings along the sides, and sealed the ends with clay and bark. Each log became a hive, warm, dry, protected from wind. She placed them carefully along the southern wall near the gardens. The stone behind them held heat through cool nights. The bees discovered the hives within weeks. By midsummer, the valley hummed constantly. Eleanor harvested the first honey late that autumn, only a few jars, but it was enough to prove the idea worked. The second year she built more hives, then more. Soon the valley held dozens. The bees spread farther into the mountains, pollinating flowers, returning with nectar, turning sunlight into honey. Eleanor stored the jars inside a root cellar she carved into the base of the granite wall. The stone kept the temperature cool year-round. The honey lasted indefinitely. By the third summer, something extraordinary happened. Her gardens tripled in size, not because she planted more seeds, but because the bees increased pollination across the entire valley. Vegetables grew larger, fruits from wild shrubs grew heavier, berry bushes multiplied along the creek. The entire valley became more productive. The bees had changed the ecosystem itself. Eleanor realized she was no longer just surviving, she was cultivating something much larger, a hidden farm, a hidden orchard, a hidden apiary, producing more honey than she could ever consume alone. That was the moment she began thinking about Redstone Creek again, not as a home, but as a market. Because honey traveled well, it did not spoil, and people paid well for sweetness in a frontier town where sugar was expensive. The first trip back took nearly 3 days. She loaded 2 crates onto the mule, each crate filled with jars wrapped in cloth. Cole trotted beside her as they followed the old trails back toward civilization. Eleanor entered Redstone Creek at dawn. Most people barely noticed her. Time had changed her appearance. Hard work, mountain sun, years alone. But the honey caught attention immediately, because sweetness travels farther than reputation. And the moment the first jar opened in Mercer's store, Eleanor Vance understood something important. The sheriff had taken her land, but the mountains had given her something far more powerful, a place nobody could find, a farm nobody could tax, and a harvest nobody could stop. If you want to see how that quiet honey trade turned into something far bigger than a few jars on a store counter, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The first time Eleanor Vance returned to Redstone Creek with honey, people assumed it was luck. The second time, they assumed it was coincidence. By the third visit, people began asking questions. Because honey like that did not simply appear. The jars Eleanor brought into Mercer's store were always identical. Glass containers sealed with wax, wrapped carefully in cloth, each one filled with thick golden honey that smelled faintly of mountain flowers. And every time Mercer opened a jar, the entire store seemed to pause. The taste alone convinced people to buy, but it was the consistency that started rumors. Eleanor appeared every few months, never more than a dozen crates, never less than 6. Always alone except for the mule and the quiet black dog that waited patiently beside the door. No wagon, no hired hands, no explanation. People tried asking questions the second year. Where did the honey come from? How many hives did she keep? Where was the farm? Eleanor answered none of them. She sold the honey, collected her money, purchased salt, flour, tools and glass jars, then left town before sunset. The mystery irritated certain people, especially Sheriff Conrad Bell. Bell remembered the day he forced Eleanor from her land. He remembered the thin mule, the small bundle of possessions, the quiet resignation on her face. That woman should have disappeared into the mountains and starved. Most people did. But 6 years later, she was walking into town with a product better than anything grown in the valley. Bell mentioned this to Wallace Mercer at the bank one afternoon. "You ever wonder where she's getting it?" Bell asked. Mercer adjusted his spectacles. "She sells honey," he said calmly. "A lot of honey." Bell leaned against the counter. "More honey than a single person could produce." Mercer shrugged. "She might have help." "From who?" Mercer didn't answer, but the question stayed in Bell's mind. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued building something the town could not see. Each winter she expanded the valley, not physically, but agriculturally. The honey business grew quickly. The bees multiplied every season. By the 4th year, the hollow log hives lined the entire southern slope. Some sat near the gardens, others were placed deeper into the forest where wildflowers grew thick. The bees worked miles of mountainside, and every autumn Eleanor harvested dozens of gallons of honey. But honey alone was not the true strength of the valley. The bees changed the land itself. Flowers spread faster, berry bushes multiplied. Wild apple trees hidden in the forest began producing heavier fruit. Pollination turned the valley into something rare, an isolated ecosystem growing stronger every year. Eleanor began planting fruit trees along the warm stone ridge, apple, pear, cherry. Young saplings she purchased quietly during her visits to town. The granite wall behind them trapped sunlight through the day. At night, it released warmth slowly, protecting the trees from frost. Within 4 years, the orchard began producing fruit. The apples were extraordinary, large, sweet, bright red from mountain sunlight. They ripened later than the valley orchards, which meant Eleanor could sell fresh fruit weeks after everyone else's harvest ended. That advantage doubled her profits. Mercer noticed, so did the ranchers. People began buying her apples the moment she arrived. The fruit lasted longer than ordinary apples. The flavor was stronger. And because Eleanor never revealed the orchard's location, no one could compete. The hidden valley was slowly becoming something powerful. A private agricultural system completely invisible to the outside world. Honey, fruit, vegetables, wild berries, all growing inside a place no map recorded. But secrets rarely remain perfect forever. One autumn afternoon, Sheriff Bell decided to follow her. Eleanor had just finished selling the last crate of apples at Mercer's store. She purchased salt, 2 new axes, and several empty jars. Bell watched her leave town just before sunset. He saddled his horse quietly and rode after her. Eleanor traveled slowly along the western road. Cole trotted beside the mule as usual. Bell kept his distance. Half a mile back, hidden behind low ridges. At first the trail remained clear, the same road everyone used when traveling toward the hills. But after an hour, Eleanor turned north onto a narrow path most travelers ignored. Bell followed. Another mile passed, then 2. The path narrowed further. Trees thickened around the trail. Finally, Eleanor reached a small stream crossing. She stopped. Bell watched from the trees. She knelt beside the water, filled a small bucket, then continued walking upstream. Bell waited several minutes before following, but when he reached the crossing, something confused him. The trail vanished, completely. No wagon ruts, no footprints, nothing. The ground beyond the stream was solid rock. Eleanor had walked directly into the water before leaving the trail, and Bell had no idea where she went afterward. He searched the area for nearly an hour, riding along both sides of the creek, scanning the forest, but the mountains swallowed tracks quickly. And by nightfall, Eleanor Vance had disappeared again. Bell rode back to town frustrated. Mercer listened patiently when the sheriff told the story. "You lost her," Mercer said simply. "She vanished." Mercer smiled faintly. "Then perhaps she prefers it that way." Bell did not like mysteries, especially ones that made him look foolish. But the truth was simpler than he realized. Eleanor had spent years learning every path through those mountains, every ridge, every creek, every rock shelf where footprints vanished. She never used the same trail twice when returning home. Sometimes she followed streams, sometimes she walked along stone ridges, sometimes she circled miles away before approaching the valley. Because the first rule of hidden empires is simple: if no one finds the door, no one can enter. By the 8th year, Eleanor Vance was wealthier than nearly any rancher in Redstone Creek. Not in land, not in cattle, but in something harder to measure: control. Her valley produced food every season. Her bees multiplied without limit. Her orchards grew larger every year, and no one outside the mountains knew where it all came from. The sheriff suspected, the bank wondered, but suspicion without evidence is nothing. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued walking quietly into town each harvest season, selling honey, selling apples, buying tools, and returning to the mountains before sunset. The town believed they were witnessing a small mystery. What they did not realize was something far larger. Because the valley was no longer just a farm, it was becoming something else entirely, a hidden empire growing quietly in the wild. By the 10th year, people in Redstone Creek had stopped asking where Eleanor Vance lived, not because the curiosity disappeared, but because no one could answer it. She appeared every season like clockwork: spring for honey, autumn for apples, sometimes jars of preserved berries, sometimes thick blocks of beeswax wrapped in cloth. She never brought the same quantity twice, but it was always enough to sell out before sunset. Merchants began planning around her visits. Mercer kept empty shelves ready for the honey. Bakers waited for the wax. Families bought apples in bulk because they knew the fruit lasted nearly twice as long as anything grown locally. The strange part was that Eleanor never seemed hurried. She walked into town calmly, sold her goods, purchased supplies, then disappeared back into the mountains before anyone thought to follow. But what the town did not see was what had happened inside the hidden valley over those 10 years. Because the orchard had grown. The first row of apple trees Eleanor planted beside the granite wall had multiplied into 3 rows, then 5, then an entire slope of fruit trees climbing slowly up the warm southern hillside. The bees expanded even faster. Every hollow log hive she built eventually filled, so she began building new ones deeper into the forest, then more along the creek. By the 10th summer, there were more than 100 active hives scattered throughout the valley. The air hummed constantly from spring through early autumn. But the real strength of the valley was not honey, and it was not apples, it was time. Eleanor had something no one in Redstone Creek possessed. Years of uninterrupted control over a piece of land no one else even knew existed. While ranchers fought droughts and cattle prices, while banks called in loans, while fences broke and storms destroyed crops, the hidden valley continued growing quietly stronger. Every tree matured, every hive multiplied, every season added more soil, more plants, more stability. By the time Sheriff Bell finally retired, Eleanor Vance's Mountain Valley produced more food per acre than any farm in the county. No taxes, no debt, no neighbors, just quiet expansion. And eventually, even the town stopped wondering where the honey came from. Because something else happened. People began accepting it. Some mysteries simply became part of local life. Children grew up hearing stories about the woman in the mountains, the widow who vanished, the beekeeper no one could find, the rancher without a ranch. Years passed. Then, one autumn morning, something unusual happened. Eleanor arrived in Redstone Creek with more crates than anyone had ever seen before. Not 6, not 10, nearly 20. Apples, honey, jars of preserved berries, blocks of wax. The mule carried 2 crates, another mule followed behind, and another. Cole, now older and slower, still walked beside her. Mercer stared at the crates filling his store. "That's more than usual," he said. Eleanor nodded. "The valley is full now." "Full?" She smiled slightly. "Full enough." Mercer studied her for a moment. "You planning to stay in town?" "No." "Then why bring so much?" Eleanor looked around the store, at the shelves, at the people gathering to buy fruit. Then she said something no one expected. "Because I won't need to sell it anymore." The room went quiet. Mercer blinked. "You're retiring?" "In a way." "What does that mean?" Eleanor lifted one apple from the crate, turned it slowly in her hand. "The mountains gave me more than I ever needed." "So you're done farming?" She shook her head. "No. I'm done hiding." The words spread through Redstone Creek faster than the honey ever had. Within weeks, people began hearing rumors that Eleanor had hired workers, that she was buying land again, that she planned to build a new orchard somewhere near the valley. None of them were exactly correct, but none of them were entirely wrong either. Because Eleanor Vance eventually did purchase land again, quietly, not in Redstone Creek, but farther west, land no one else wanted, rocky slopes, poor grazing, cheap property that bankers dismissed immediately. People assumed she was making a mistake, just as they assumed years earlier when she disappeared into the mountains. But Eleanor knew something they didn't. The same lesson she learned the day Sheriff Bell forced her from her home. Land itself was never the real power. Control was, and control came from understanding the land better than anyone else. The hidden valley still existed, still produced honey, still produced fruit, still remained invisible in the mountains, but now it was no longer her only resource. Because the woman the sheriff once forced into the wilderness had spent a decade learning something the town never understood. You don't build an empire by fighting the world. You build it by stepping somewhere the world refuses to look. And by the time Redstone Creek finally realized what Eleanor Vance had built in the mountains, her quiet empire was already far too large to take away. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.